And here we are, ladies and gentlemen. We're doing the great headphone exchange. Welcome to Talkback. I'm Peter Christian. John King is over there being his producer self, helping our guests to get acclimated to wearing these silly things we call headphones so that we can get callers on the line. And joining us in the studio, we've got our good friend, Bob Seiden-Schwartz. Good morning, Bob. How are you, sir? Oh, it works better when the microphone is in the on position.
Good morning, Peter, John. Right. And we've got Dr. Levine with us today.
Dr. Levine?
Previously.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Welcome back, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Fantastic. Now, you look right at home in those headphones, I got to tell you.
Well, it means I must look like a space alien, I guess.
A new career is in the offing, I believe.
I need it at this point in my life. Right?
So, Bob, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about what the work Dr. Levine is doing.
Well, we've had Dr. Levine on the show before. He's an expert in China and its political and social affairs. He's written several books, and I'm going to let Dr. Levine give a little bit of background on several of those books and one that currently he is in the process, and please excuse me, either of about to be published or already is published. So if you'd be kind enough to give us a little bit of a background, please.
Okay. Thanks very much for the opportunity. So the book that is about to be published is a book that I wrote with a friend of mine named Alexander Pantsov, and it's a biography of Deng Xiaoping, who was the man who led China after Mao Zedong from about 1978 till his death in 1997. And it is called, strangely enough, Deng Xiaoping, A Revolutionary Life, and it's being published in April by Oxford University Press. And it actually follows up a book that was published 3 years ago, a biography of Mao Zedong, who ruled China from 1949 to 1976. And that was published by Simon & Schuster. And both of them are major biographies. And my role was a secondary one, but they're really great books. So go out there and buy them.
I know from our past discussions that you've kind of sorted out a lot of the misconceptions that the West had about Mao Zedong in that first book. What are some of the big misconceptions the West has about Xiaoping?
About Deng Xiaoping? Well, I think maybe the major misconception is that he was really a nice little guy. He was very short. He was 4'11". So, when someone is short, you assume that they're really good people.
Is that true?
Well, I don't know.
Hey,
maybe
I'm trying to stand up as tall as I can, John.
It's like maybe that's why Peter's so affable.
No, but you've got to be under 5 feet, that's all.
Okay.
And I have friends who are, so I'm not saying anything against that.
My mom was under 5 feet.
Okay. But she was not the ruler of China.
This
presumably.
is true, but she had a brown belt in jiu-jitsu.
Well,
she was certainly the ruler of the Christian household.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
In that case, she could have competed to be the leader of China, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah.
But Deng Xiaoping actually, from early on in his career, was a rather ruthless man who resorted to violence all the time. And he worshipped Mao Zedong from very early on, too, so he was really one of Mao's henchmen. And only after Mao died did he really change his tune. But he is responsible, in part, for many of the changes that have occurred in China since 1976, when Mao died, namely the whole turn away from this revolutionary communism and going on the path of a kind of state capitalism, a very different society, I mean.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask, how in the world did he accomplish that? Because it was someone who was as revered, or at least was supposed to be revered in China as Mao Zedong. How in the world did Deng Xiaoping change that paradigm, if you will, going from one extreme direction, really almost doing an about face and heading more towards the West?
Yes, that's true. I think what happened basically is that in the 1960s he was politically purged. He was kicked out of power. He'd been the number 3 person in the whole hierarchy, and he was attacked physically during the Cultural Revolution. He and his wife were sent out to the countryside, and he had a lot of time just to think and reflect about what was going on. And he realized after a lot of reflection that things were not the way they should be. And so when he took over in 1978, 1980, he decided to try something new. The old system didn't work. It took him a long time to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. So he kind of matured, in a sense.
Yes, that's right. That's one way to. That's a very polite way to say.
Or as our presidents would say, he evolved his opinions.
He evolved.
On things.
That's right.
So, Dr. Levine, you're talking about he's not sitting. This is not Siddhartha. He's not sitting under a tree someplace and having a come to Jesus moment, or did he? I mean, was there a
Come to capitalism.
moment? Was there something that happened? What other influences? Were there other people in his life? Were there other issues that really were the trigger for him to go, you know what, this isn't working. We're going to join the 20th century. Something's got to be different.
Well, I think it was a process, actually, and it started during the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, early 1960s, a period in which maybe 35 million Chinese died of starvation from famine.
Now, forgive me, Doctor, but I keep hearing eras, and they all start with a capital letter, right? The Great Leap Forward, the
Yes,
Cultural Revolution, and then what was the one under Deng Xiaoping?
Well, there's nothing like that under Deng Xiaoping, actually.
Right.
Well, no, that's not true. It's the reform and
Okay,
opening.
all right.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of Chinese things begin with capital R's.
I was just curious. Forgive me for interrupting.
No, that's a very good point, actually. It's a very important point. Anyway, things were really in a very bad state in the late 50s, early 60s. I mean, no other country in the world has ever had a famine which took 35 million lives. I mean, just think about that. It's a figure that's so large. We don't know what it is exactly, but it's in that range.
Now, how, in any other country, wouldn't that have engendered a popular revolution of saying, you're letting us starve to death, we've got to change things? Or were they so indoctrinated that they didn't know how to do that?
Well, in fact, the situation was so desperate that people were not able to think about politics. I mean, they were just scrounging for the next little bit of food. And there was actually, in some parts of China, of cannibalism during that period.
Wow.
People were, I mean, the stories are just horrendous.
So Dr. Levine, was this starvation, was this brought on by a political movement? Or what were the forces, the catalysts? Because this was not something that was unique to China's history. This has been going on for centuries in terms of, events like that. Or is that not correct?
No, that's true. I mean, there certainly have been periods of famine in Chinese history, including earlier in the 20th century. But this particular famine really was caused by political decisions by Mao Zedong at the top. And what happened basically was that he gave a directive to the whole country to double agricultural production in 1 year, which is, I mean, anyone who has a vegetable garden in Missoula would know that that's insane. You can't do that in 1 year, let alone nationally. And so all the officials below said, yes, we're doing it. We've doubled production. And so what happened was that the government then took all the grain from the countryside, which didn't exist, to feed the cities, and they exported it as well. And the people who grew the food were left starving.
Oh, so it basically culled the rural areas of China
Yeah, that's
and
right.
reinforced the cities.
The cities and also export.
This is kind of a dark way to talk about this, but did that hasten the mechanization and the modernization of China because it put more focus on the urban centers?
No, not really. Not at that point. I mean, there were other kinds of crazy policies as well being pursued at that period. But anyway, Deng Xiaoping began to reflect upon what was going wrong at that time.
Okay, and with that, we'll hold on that for a second. By the way, we have all three lines open. We'd love to have some calls for Dr. Levine. This is interesting stuff, folks. If you don't know your history very well, we're learning step by step what happened to make China what the country that it is today. And, of course, I'm sure it's still evolving today. So we, if you will, we're going to come right back with more of Talk Back. Our number is 721-1290. All three lines are open. We'd love to hear from you. You know, there's some cosmic forces going on here because I did not intend to. I just grabbed a song from the Doobie Brothers, just happens to be China Grove. Anyway, but let Bob Seidenschwartz, you have some more questions for Dr. Levine.
Yeah, and I was going to say before that, if we have David Bowie and my little China girl next, Peter, then I'm going to start the question if it's just all happens.
Get to work on that, Peter.
Yeah. So, Dr. Levine, when Deng is having this, reflective moment, help us understand, then, to take it from the reflective to the implementation. What actually had to happen? Who supported him? What were some of their motivations? And actually, what were specifics to the implementation in terms of what he was trying to achieve?
Great question. Let me go back one step because I am an historian. I won't take you back 5,000 years, but just a couple of years.
Okay.
And when Mao died in 1976, there had been a period of very fierce political struggle before then, as well as economic problems. And so there was widespread agreement in the leadership, most of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, that things had to change. It wasn't clear how they would change, But the new leader who followed Mao Zedong said that Mao Zedong was a great man and everything should be followed. He was maybe one of the people who wanted to continue things the way they were because Mao had appointed him. Therefore, he wanted to be nice to, even though Mao was dead, he felt a kind of obligation. But I think within the leadership of the party and in the country as a whole, there was a sense that the Maoist way had not worked, that it led to one catastrophe after another. So when Deng Xiaoping took power, he did not have a real program. He didn't know what to do. It was very experimental, and he said the old way didn't work. We've got to try something new. So it was that kind of open-mindedness more than anything else that I think is critical here.
Allow me to ask, China has always been an enigma to the rest of the world, and you say that Deng Xiaoping decided to go another direction. Obviously, they didn't exist in a vacuum. Was he able to learn from what was going on in Europe or what had happened in America? In other words, was he a student of history, world history, to say, you know what, if this worked here, it might work with us?
He was not really a student of anything, really, except of power. But he had spent, when he was a young man, he had worked in France for about 5 years in the 1920s. And he'd also studied in Moscow in 1926, so he had some sense of the outside world. He'd also traveled to the Soviet Union during the 1950s and 1960s. But neither he nor any of the other Chinese leaders under Mao Zedong were allowed to travel to the Western world, for example. So they were really quite ignorant of the world outside. And when they began to travel, they were actually shocked by what they saw. They had this ideological sense that capitalism had failed, that the outside world was behind everything else. And when they opened their eyes, when they got off the planes, they saw that it was totally false.
Well, when it sounds like he was a young idealist, a young violent idealist in many ways. Is that true? Did he change, or did he just strengthen his ideals over time? And
he wasn't really an idealist, I think, as a young man. I mean, he like many young Chinese, felt resentful that China had been beaten by Japan, beaten by the West, that it had been treated in a very humiliating way. But he didn't really. Mao Zedong is someone who explored different ways of thinking. I mean, when he was a young man, he went through every ism that there was: liberalism, communism, Buddhism, you name it. He'd experimented with it. But Deng Xiaoping came to Marxism, Leninism, or communism straight away without trying anything else.
Well, that sounds like someone that's a true idealist, not an experimental idealist.
Well, I think it was really the people he was associating with were the idealists, and he was younger than they were, and they sort of took him by the hand and said, "This is what we're doing. This is how you ought to think."
Now, this idealism we're describing, that didn't happen in a vacuum. Who were their mentors? Was it the communist movement of the Russian Revolution that had this influence upon Mao and successive followers?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, after 1917, when the Russian communists took power, then they were promoting a world revolution, as they called it, and they had agents going all over the world, including to China, who were promoting, selling basically the idea of communism. And so when Deng Xiaoping, as a young man, was in France, there were communists from Russia and elsewhere who were promoting communism there. And the Chinese Communist Party actually had a branch in Europe, which is what Deng Xiaoping joined as a young man, a teenager, actually.
So we talked about how Xiaoping adopted capitalism, but I mean, this is still the guy, I believe, right, in charge during Tiananmen Square and other.
John, do you want to give a little bit when you say adopted capitalism?
Well,
not in the sense of capitalism in the Western world and in this country.
Right, but a shift towards capitalism away from the kind of severe communism that they had under Mao. So I guess my question is, why didn't he, or did he adopt any of the other Western values, like more liberal freedom of speech rules, things like that?
What a terrible thought. I mean, from the get-go, there was an enormous amount of resistance within the leadership of the Communist Party against changing anything. I mean, some people were in favor of economic changes, to be sure, but any kind of political liberalization, any kind of democratization, these men knew very well, and I say men because almost all of them were men, by the way, very few women in leadership positions, realized that that would be a tremendous threat to their own power. So the one thing that they have never wanted to do is to open up the system So there could be criticism, there could be open discussion, anything like that. I mean, a radio show like this in China is unthinkable, for example.
Even today.
Even today,
Now,
absolutely.
I hate to jump forward in time, but like right now, do you see China becoming more accessible, or do you see the government clamping down more on speech?
In the last couple of years, since the president of China, I shouldn't call him the new guy, but what the heck?
The dude.
The dude, that's right, the dude in power. Xi Jinping has come into power. Things have gotten much more repressive. He's really been cracking down on everything you can think of. The media, religion.
The internet?
The internet, absolutely.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yes, things are, in that sense, have been getting considerably worse in the last 2 years.
You might want to say he's the originator of net neutrality, if you will. So we're going to take a little break. We have all three lines open. If you'd like to visit with Dr. Stephen Levine, he's joining us here in studio right now. We're talking about China and the history that has gone through over the last 50, 60 years. Love to hear from you. If you have a question or comment, maybe you lived in China. Maybe I know a lot of friends who were missionaries in China. 721-1290 is our number. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be right back. All right, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. The Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Dr. Stephen Levine joining us here in studio from the University of Montana, Department of History. And we've got Joe on the line. Joe, thank you for holding. You're on Talkback. Please go ahead, sir.
Hey, thank you. I think President Obama was at a economic summit in China just a month or two ago, and he came back kind of proud that he had made these deals to sell high-end technology to China. And I thought, at a time when they're expanding in the South China Sea and they're a potential adversary, that seems a little naive. But all this whole situation with China for large corporations has been, they can't resist a huge market like that, but they go over there and then they steal all their technology. And finally, what does Max Baucus have to do with it in this as our ambassador? I haven't heard anything about what he's been doing, but any ideas on those comments?
I think he's happily retired there, and after doing all the damage he could here. But anyway, Dr. Levine,
that's a good question. Thanks for it, Joe. Max Baucus has been kind of the invisible man, and I think that's exactly what the administration wanted him to be by sending him to China. So invisible and also very quiet. He hasn't made any waves. He hasn't really taken part in anything that we know of outside. Anyway.
In Max's defense, he's always kind of been a background operator. He's never been the front guy.
Well, okay.
Right? I mean, even when he was in Congress, he was the one making the deals, kind of grouping everybody together and completing alliances to get legislation passed. He was the front runner for the Affordable Care Act. Is it possible he's doing something like that in China?
No, it's not possible. That's not how the world works.
So you think he's just a token there?
Well, I mean, he hasn't done anything outrageously bad. I mean, I might have expected that from Max, but that's not the case. He's behaved himself, apparently. No waves, and ambassadors aren't that important anymore. Right. Anyway,
I was just going to ask you what could he actually do? I mean, relations with the United States are primarily political. So, I mean, like you say, what could an ambassador really do?
Well, not much at this point, I think, really. There's no crisis in U.S.-China relations. Things are going along, and kind of even keel, you might say. I mean, no great achievements, I think, no great problems either. In the longer term, as Joe's question suggested, actually, we'll come back to that, there certainly are growing Chinese activities in the South China Sea. There are challenges to American positions there as well as that of our allies. But those are not something that's going to create a crisis, like there is in eastern Ukraine, for example, or in the Middle East. Those are sort of over-the-horizon issues.
Back to our previous topic, we had mentioned Xiaoping and Tiananmen Square and a cultural or an attempted revolution almost that got quashed. And my question for you is, there is concern from some people that if the yuan drops enough or GDP slows enough or growth slows enough, that there might be an opportunity for another democratic uprising. In fact, we saw protests recently. I think they were called the umbrella protests. And do you sense that there's a growing movement in that direction?
There's no evidence of that. I mean, the umbrella movement that you referred to was in Hong Kong last fall, And Hong Kong, although the sort of political liberties are shrinking, even though they're not supposed to be, under the institutions that were established after 1997, Hong Kong still has a free press. It has freedom of assembly. It's a very different kind of situation entirely. I mean, if anything like that even began to happen in Shanghai or Beijing or so forth, and any of the other major cities, it would be nipped in the bud before 5 people could get together.
Yeah, we're going to take a little break. We have our top of the hour break here, and we have all 3 lines open. We'd love to hear from you. Dr. Stephen Levine joining us here in studio. We're talking about China, and we're also going to talk about what it has to do with right here in Missoula, Montana. So we will continue. And the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio continues. Peter Christian, John King, Bob Seidenschwartz in studio. Our guest is Dr. Stephen Levine from the Department of History at the University of Montana. And our friend Chuck has been waiting very patiently all the way through this long break. So, Chuck, first of all, thank you for holding, sir. You're on with Dr. Levine.
Yes. When I grew up in Detroit in the 70s under Jimmy Carter, a person by the name of Leonard Woodcock, the president of the United Auto Workers, helped establish our embassy there for the president. And when he was there, he gave a speech about how the United States needed to share its job base, have its fair share of unemployed people, and provide wealth to China to create new jobs, which we're still doing today, I understand. How much of this has had a play on the 93 million people we have unemployed in this country now? And is this still part of our embassy's mission?
Is the question, is our embassy's mission to destroy the American economy? Is that what I'm...
Well, that's one way of putting it. But I guess to share our jobs with the rest of the world and to share our wealth and so forth.
No, I think, first of all, I think Leonard Woodcock, I'm glad you mentioned him. He was one of the early ambassadors after the resumption of U.S.-China diplomatic relations, and he was a very skilled negotiator. I think the notion back in the 1970s and afterwards under Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan and other presidents was that China could become prosperous and China's prosperity would actually help the American economy, that by greater amounts of trade and commerce that it would help create American jobs too as the China market developed. What has happened, and you're absolutely right, is that a lot of manufacturing jobs, huge numbers of manufacturing jobs left the United States and went to China. They also gone to Mexico, Vietnam, and other countries as well. And so we've had to deal with the problems of unemployment that probably would not have existed had it not been for those other lower wage places, of course.
It also seems to me there's part of Leonard's job as the head of a union going to China. Like there had to have been a fear on the part, and there still is, of trade normalization between U.S. and China and the effect that might have on union jobs and wages, right? So it makes sense from a domestic standpoint to have a union head run that show.
Well, I don't think that was really a calculation. I mean, it seems to make sense, but the Chinese economy was so far behind the American economy in the 1970s that there was no one really thought, including the Chinese leaders themselves, that they would be able to make the kinds of gigantic changes that in fact occurred over the next 20 or 25 years. I mean, the per capita income in China probably 1970s was probably about $200 U.S. Now it's in the thousands. So it's really a world of difference.
Do you mind if I asked if you have a positive, do you see a bright future for China? Do you see it coming around, or do you see the government clamping down more and more?
I think in the foreseeable future, which may only be till tomorrow, depends on how much pollution there is in the valley here and in Beijing, there's going to be continued repression in China. I think the political future is a very bleak one, although it could change dramatically. I mean, things have changed dramatically in other countries without a lot of obvious warning signs.
And so, you make a great point. I mean, a lot of these giant empires that fall do so in a surprising way. I don't think many people called the way that Russia backed away from its Soviet history and then kind of came back with Putin. But my question is, what do you think could happen to shake up? And as I had mentioned before, some people think it might be soon to shake up the situation in China and open it up to more of a democratic frontier.
Well, I think that China specialists look at the economic situation that you touched on before. Chinese economy is slowing down somewhat, it's only growing at 7% a year, which from an American perspective looks really great. But in terms of creating jobs and maintaining social stability, there are some serious problems there. There are financial problems in China. There are enormous environmental pollution problems. The air in Chinese cities is unbreathable. So all these kinds of things potentially could create social disturbances. But the Chinese Communist Party has multiple systems of repression in place to keep people in their place.
Okay, we have a question from Facebook, and it is kind of along the same lines. So this is from Katie. She says, starvation is an effective tool to break and reshape a population. North Korea is a longtime client state of China and is a buffer, and starvation is long been used there by the ruling class. Do you think China will work to reform the government of North Korea to alleviate the suffering of the North Korean people?
Short answer is no, really. I think the Chinese government is going to sustain North Korea as an independent country, not because they like the North Koreans or because they approve of the North Korean state, but just as a political buffer zone, basically.
And if it collapses, right, a lot of those North Koreans will be coming to China, I would assume.
The Chinese government does not want millions of Koreans coming across the border, that's for sure. And that could happen because they share a long border.
We're going to take a little break, come right back. We have all three lines open. If you'd like to get involved in this conversation, 721-1290 is our number. Talking with Dr. Stephen Levine from the University of Montana Department of History. He's got a brand new book called Deng Xiaoping, A Revolutionary Life, to be published actually coming up in April. And we'll talk more about that and hopefully get your calls and questions as well. Or we just got a question on Facebook. You can do that as well. We'll be right back. 721-1290 is the number, 1-800-568-5309. This is the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Joining us in studio, Dr. Stephen Levine, who is from the University of Montana. We do have a caller. Let's go right to the phone and say good morning to Craig. Craig, you're on with Dr. Levine. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, rise and shine. But Johnny, he mentioned Russia. And it's always been my opinion that Russia went bottoms up because they were chasing rabbits, I guess one might say, when Reagan was, saying how he had Star Wars and stuff like that. The Russians spent their economy broke trying to keep up the arms race. And it's my opinion that what occurred there 25 years ago or what is exactly what's occurring here today. Not so much chasing military things, but just we've done it by not backing our money with any legitimate source. But nonetheless, has very little to do with China.
So did you have a question for
No,
Dr.
I
Levine?
just wanted to make a comment about Russia, being as you opened that door there, John.
Oh, yeah, no, I understand.
Thanks for the call, sir.
Well, since we're talking about economies, I wanted to backtrack to what you said about the 7% GDP growth. That's a number that I think many people question. If I'm not mistaken, I think that's the number that China itself reports that it grows. And many people think that the GDP, judging by the amount of shipping goods, the amount of electricity used on the grid, that sort of thing, think it's as low as 5% or lower. What do you think about those ideas, or at least the thought that China's manipulating its GDP output? Yeah.
I think you're right that certainly economists, and I'm not an economist studying China actually, but what I've read suggests that the Chinese figures are kind of phony, and they've been phony for a very long time. And so there are different ways of discounting it. And the ways you suggested, actually looking at concrete consumption of electricity or other kinds of inputs, is a way of checking on those figures, to be sure. But there's no way we can independently calculate the Chinese economy accurately anyway, so I think people do tend to use those figures and then discount them in their heads.
Okay, so this is what we're going by, but we know it's not true.
So John, as an example, in the investment business, copper is kind of the canary in the coal mine. If you forget about whatever they're reporting publicly, when you see demand for copper starting to slow, that's a signal on a global economic basis that things are slowing. And we're seeing that in the commodities markets where commodity demand has slowed, prices have dropped precipitously, whether it's oil, copper, various other types of resources. That's a telltale sign. And I'd like to ask Steve, in terms of you brought up off air that China or Peter said, is a sleeping giant. Could it take over the world at some point?
Take over their own country.
We need to bring a little bit of clarity to that because they've made tremendous progress. I mean, really, since the 1970s, it's really something that's unprecedented. But China's got some real severe problems, starting with a demographic issue. They also have lack of water, or what water they have is incredibly polluted. You've got a population moving from a rural existence to an urban existence, which puts tremendous demand on both infrastructure and resource usage. So if you want to elaborate and enlighten us a little bit on that, please.
Well, I think the main point really is that China's major problems are domestic problems. They're really not. I mean, China is involved in the world. It's a global power now, but it's a global power looking for resources, looking for outlets for markets, etc. It's not a global power like the Soviet Union was, trying to take over countries. I mean, China is certainly not a pacifist country or anything like that. It has a very large military, to be sure, but the Chinese have not invaded a neighboring country like Afghanistan, and they did take over Tibet. They took over Xinjiang, which are parts of their own country, and they'd like to take over Taiwan. But the degree of problems domestically is so immense that I think neither Xi Jinping or any other Chinese leaders really have a short-term or long-term solution to them.
If you were installed as the new leader of China, what would be the first problem you would address? What is the most imminent threat?
The first thing I would do is resign, I think. But no, I think economically, really, maybe the problem of pollution and water, I put those at the top of the list, really, because they are immense problems. And the Chinese have enormous projects to try to alleviate that. For example, they're transferring a huge amount of water from the south of China, which is more than water sufficient, to the north, which is really very deficit. But this may create problems, unanticipated problems, that will make things even worse. They put a huge dam on the Yangtze River, for example, that opened up in 2009, and now there's this huge lake full of polluted sediments and poisonous materials and whatnot. Chinese and other foreign scientists warned that this would happen, but the Chinese leadership just ignored it, basically, and went ahead. So they have these, I mean, in their history, too, going back thousands of years, they have these projects to control water on a huge scale, but they often create massive problems that they don't know how to solve.
And Steve, are we not seeing the beginnings or already an environmental movement within China, particularly amongst the wealthy, who are finding this untenable, speaking out and leading, a discussion about, hey, this has got to stop because we can't live in this type of existence?
Well, one of the solutions of the wealthiest Chinese, of course, is it literally is a movement, and it's a movement to go abroad, to get houses in San Francisco, Vancouver, other places where the atmosphere is much clearer. So there's a kind of exit strategy, you might say, about the wealthy, which has been accelerating.
Can I ask, I know this is has always been a sensitive question, but about the one-child policy and that child almost always being a male, or is that a misnomer? Am I misunderstanding that? And I know there have been millions of abortions and that sort of thing. So tell me how that has affected the population, because the whole idea was to try to control population growth, right?
Right, and that's something actually associated with Deng Xiaoping, not during the Mao period. Now, what's happened, of course, is that there has been selective abortion. Ultrasound now that you can discover the sex of the fetus, and lots of the girls are destroyed, obviously. So that's created a growing imbalance between men and women, and that has social consequences. There are millions of Chinese men who will never be able to get married. So that creates social pressures. It has social effects otherwise in society, too. And there's been some reconsideration of that policy, though. It's being eased. The other thing, and Bob referred to this briefly in passing, is that there is increasingly aging population in China, so that the demographic bonus that they had for cheap labor now is gone, and that's creating economic problems down the pike.
I was just going to say, I saw a show, I forget which one it was, but it featured a man from China who was wanted to get married, but he was very short. And so he had his legs lengthened. He actually had his legs separated and several inches of bone put into his lower legs to make him like 4 or 5 inches taller. And he was willing to go through that pain and suffering so that he could be tall enough to get a wife. I mean, I'm thinking, wow, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that he didn't think about elevator shoes or boots, basically.
Anyway, we're going to take a break. Catherine is waiting to be visit with you. She'll have lots of good questions for you. We also have 2 lines open. Dr. Stephen Levine is joining us here in studio. We'll be right back with more of Talkback. Boom. We're back on Talkback. The number is 721-1290. John King's over there. I'm Peter Christian, Bob Seidenschwartz, and then joining us here in studio, Dr. Stephen Levine. And we're talking about China and things thereof. And Catherine's been waiting very patiently. Catherine, go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay. China has been building the Spratly outposts in the South China Seas. There's 5 already built and 2 more are in development. These are islands that they are building, probably for military expansion to control and to assert control over South China Seas and shipping lanes specifically. Are we developing closer relations with Vietnam and Myanmar, India, Bali, Indochina, to try to counter some of this? And do you have any idea of what their long-term goal is in that arena?
Yeah, very, very good question. I think the Chinese long-term goal is to establish themselves as the premier naval power in that part of the world. And so they've got all these territorial conflicts with their neighbors, including with Japan, with the Philippines, with Indonesia and so forth. And so they're trying to establish, they're actually building, as you said, they're actually building islands, taking atolls and reefs and dumping stuff on it and creating islands where there was just water before. And that's part of a strategy to connect up also with naval bases and naval access in the Indian Ocean, which scares the Indians certainly. And what we're doing, I think, is trying to reassert our traditional going back to World War II, relationships with Japan, Korea. Vietnam is the new kid in town, you might say. I mean, for someone in my generation to think that the United States and Vietnam have such close relationships, including in the military sphere, is almost unimaginable. India as well. So President Obama's trip to India was part of that notion of building up a kind of counter force against Chinese expansion.
So, Doctor, I got to ask this question. Dr. Levine, explain to the audience there's a very significant reason these little atolls are being built up because it has there's an implication to that. You want to explain exactly what that is and why it's important.
Well, the implication is both military as well as economic, I think. It's part of China's connection to the Middle East, for one thing.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, and my apologies. Yeah. I should have just come out and said this. The reason they're doing this is by law. If you can establish an island and call it a territory, then you have the ability to say this is part of your protectorate. So these little atolls, which barely are above sea level and have no purpose other than for that reason, gives China the pretext of being able to say, this is now part of our territory. Hence, well, we now have a legitimate security issue here. And I'm sorry.
That's a very good point. Thanks. You said it much better than I could, actually. And this goes back to the Law of the Seas Convention of some. Oops. I'm unplugged. What happened?
I didn't like what he was saying, so I just unplugged. I'm sorry.
I've been purged.
But it was a gentle purging. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I'm still here. I'm still standing. So, yeah, I think that is certainly the case. So the Law of the Sea Conventions do establish definitions of what is territorial waters, economic zones, and all the rest of that. These are technical issues there, but they're very important over the long term.
Oh, yeah. Catherine, anything else?
Yeah, actually, and this is kind of a longer-term thing, but are you aware that China has been funding the Hawaiian Independence movement over the last 10 years or so, with the goal of helping them establish themselves as a sovereign nation?
No, I can't say that I knew that. That's the news to me. I know that the Chinese are involved, for example, in northeastern India, selling weapons to various groups that are trying to establish their own little homelands in northeast India. But Hawaiian Independence, I don't think, is on the horizon anytime soon.
Well, like I said, it's it's a long-term goal, but they have been increasingly putting their money behind the independence movement, and it is starting to percolate a little bit in there, because the Hawaiian independence movement, the Hawaiian natives, are not real pleased with the federal government, the U.S. federal government, saying that they would give them Native American status, such as the tribes in the mainland have with their reservations. Anyway.
Yeah, no, interesting. I mean, I think the Chinese tourists in Hawaii are a much more important factor in the present time anyway.
John, go ahead. We'll take a break after that.
One of the questions I had was, one of the things brought up by Catherine was the U.S.'s links to the countries surrounding China as a sort of buffer zone to their expansionism there. A while ago, we were talking about, it seems like almost a different generation, but a pivot to Southeast Asia from the State Department. This is before, obviously, Syria and ISIS and all that sprung up. But is there still an ongoing pivot to Southeast Asia that's kind of going under the radar?
Well, actually, it wasn't to Southeast Asia. It was to Asia in general. And, I mean, this is a pivot. If there is one, it's in the slowest motion you can possibly imagine.
It's an 18-point turn.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if this was basketball, it'd have to be, how many frames per second, whatever it is. It really hasn't happened. It was a couple of years ago. It was a lot of talk in Washington about it, but it really wasn't followed through.
Hey, we're going to take a break, come right back and visit more about this. We have all three lines open. Dr. Stephen Levine is with us. We're having a fascinating discussion about China. And if you have a question or a comment, I would still love to visit with folks who have lived or worked there. Give us a call. Share your thoughts about what you observed in China. We'll be right back. This is Talkback, and it's Tuesday. Nice looking day here in western Montana. I'm Peter Christian along with John King. And, of course, we've got Bob Seidenschwartz. And with us in studio, Dr. Stephen Levine, a professor of history at the University of Montana. We're talking about China. And let's go right back to the phones and say good morning to Dave. Hi, Dave.
Yeah, good morning. I was wondering, do you think China has a chance to be the next superpower? And if they do, how long do you think that would be before it would happen?
No, I really don't think. I think the Chinese have so many domestic problems and are in a context in East Asia and the Pacific with so many other countries that are rivals to them that they don't have the capacity in any, not only in the foreseeable future, in the long-term future, I think, to dominate the region in the same way, for example, that the United States has dominated Central and South America, which was the foundation of our becoming a superpower.
With that in mind, when do you see China's power peaking?
Or has it?
When will Peking peak?
Oh, my. And perhaps you better duck.
I don't think any honest person would want to answer that question, really, because who knows? I mean, certainly China's power has grown enormously, but whether it's peaked already or whether it will continue to grow depends on so many other factors. What will Japan be like? What will Vietnam be like? Will the United States maintain its presence in the Asia-Pacific region the way we have since World War II? Who knows? It depends on what happens in other regions as well. If the Middle East keeps boiling the way it is, then there will never be a real pivot back to Asia, and we'll be, who knows what kind of small wars we might be involved in Central Asia.
You'd have to have a well-versed historian to risk a guess on that question, I imagine.
Now, Dave, anything else for Dr. Levine?
Yeah, a lot of people are questioning whether, China has what you'd call a government-controlled market rather than a free market. Some people think that that's a better form of government market than free market that the U.S. Pushes, and I'm not sure. What do you think on that?
Well, first of all, you're right that China's so-called capitalism is really not capitalism in the sense that we understand it, that it's still very largely controlled at the upper levels by the state, by state-operated enterprises, and that the Chinese government officials are very much involved in making decisions to a much higher level, I think, than in other countries. But I think that our system of government, too, certainly since the beginning of the 20th century, has had increasing levels of government supervision, not control in the same way. The Federal Reserve Bank, for example, just to name one thing, as well as policies that promote exports, a whole range of things. So there's really no sort of pure system in which you have total capitalism without any state intervention at all, nor do you have anything that is pure communism. There's never been that.
So, Steve, within China, in saying that, I think a lot of people believe that China, because of our past assumptions of what they are, is such that they control every aspect of what goes on in terms of people's daily lives, their business, their activity. China is a vast country. Over 1 billion people. Corruption is rampant. You've got provinces. You've got different districts. My feeling, and this is what I want you to comment on, is that I get the sense that there's a lot of, it's kind of like controlled chaos in many respects. So what we think are these nice methodical ways of doing things, in a lot of ways are like a dog's breakfast.
I'm not sure what a dog's breakfast is.
The dog eat breakfast after he's hungry.
I see.
It's a little bit all over the place.
All right. Okay. Gotcha. I do have a dog at home, and that's what happens on our kitchen floor. But I would go even further and say it's sort of uncontrolled chaos. There's an aspiration to control, to be sure, but often that doesn't work. And so there are lots and lots of local officials and provincial officials who go their own way. They do what they want to, although the government in Beijing ultimately has the power to enforce things, but it sometimes takes a lot of effort to do that. There's certainly no automatic response to that. So if it's really not a totalitarian country in the sense that someone pushes a button in Beijing and everyone salutes. It was never like that, even under Mao.
Question on Facebook. Brian wants to know, what will happen to our domestic economy if or when China stops using the U.S. dollar as reserve currency?
I'm going to push that over to Bob, maybe. He's the financial person here.
Well, that's, again, to your point, trying to make a projection of what could happen. Right now, the U.S. dollar is extremely strong against other global currencies. And there is a movement. In fact, you see this now with China and some of their trading partners trading in currencies other than the U.S. dollar. In the case of oil, you see agreements between Iran and China, between Russia and China, where they're making their own separate deals that do not involve our currency. So to make a forecast about what could be and what would happen, to your point, is really just pure speculation. But I can see a trend that you can't ignore, but what will come of it, that's the question.
So China's pretty tied into our debt, right? I mean, they buy up a lot of our long-term debt, if I'm not mistaken.
China owns a lot of U.S. debt.
And so they have a lot riding on us paying that off, it seems to me.
You know, John, it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. If they want to exert political pressure by saying, we own a lot of your debt, and if you don't do this, we will possibly do that, there's consequences in terms of the pros and cons here, too. So it's a global economy. On balance, countries will and need to cooperate with each other. I don't see China using that as leverage. We actually have more leverage, I believe, in terms of China's economy than they do on us. Is it a good thing that they own so much of our debt? That depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, let me just follow up on that. I mean, point out the difference between the U.S.-China relationship and that between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, when in fact we had virtually no economic relationship with the Soviets, and were in a relationship that was almost purely antagonistic. There were no cultural exchanges. There were no Russian students here, nothing like that, you know. So, but in the case of China, it's a much more complicated, much more, I wouldn't say evenly balanced, but much more complicated relationship in which there are both positive and negative elements. And so we will rise and fall together in a sense.
Okay, we're going to take a break. Go ahead, John.
Oh, well, after we get back from the break, just because you teach at the university, I have to ask, you must come into contact with students from China. Do you find younger generations having a different viewpoint on things? I was hoping maybe you could go into that after the break.
We will do that. And Dr. Stephen Levine joining us. All three lines open once again. We need to fill those up. 721-1290. We'd love to hear from you. Hey, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. Now, John, you just asked a question about the fact
the youth. Yeah. I assume that you come into contact with a lot of youth because of your work at the university, and I was wondering whether or not you see a different perspective from the younger generation on the Chinese future and China's current status.
Well, as I mentioned off the air, I am actually retired from teaching at the university now. I'm affiliated with the Department of History, so I don't have a lot of contact with younger Chinese. But I know anyway that most Chinese students who study abroad, and there are 110,000 of them actually in the United States, just undergraduates, a huge number, and even larger number if you include all the graduate students, that they are very positive on their own country's government, that they've been educated in China at the primary and middle school level, and so they accept the premises of the government and the country in which they live, which is not unusual. I mean, that happens almost everywhere.
Now, you had mentioned that there's going to be a big change coming at the University of Montana, just kind of through attrition, right?
Yeah, what's happening actually at the end of the semester is that Dr. Terry Widener, who was the former director of the Mansfield Center and now teaching Chinese politics in the political science department, is due to retire, and there is no replacement for him. So what that means is that the University of Montana, which wants to be a university for the global century, will have no one at all on the faculty teaching anything about China, 1/4 of the world's population, basically, except Chinese language. And I think that's a tremendous gap.
Okay, let's get back to the phones. All three lines are full now. Mike, you're on with Dr. Levine. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question's simple. Let's just say that we have China versus U.S. conventional war starts today. Who wins?
There's no winner in that kind of war. A conventional war would, you can think of all different kinds of scenarios, but China is a nuclear power just like the United States is, and they have the capacity, even in a conventional war, I think, to do enormous damage to our allies in the region, South Korea, Japan, and so forth, and Taiwan as well.
I was going to say, let's assume that the Taiwan trigger is pulled. What would happen? What do you foresee as the fallout?
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, it's not clear what the U.S. response would be. It would depend upon the specific circumstances, who's in the White House, who's in the Defense Department, those kinds of things, and what the regional implications are.
How many theaters are we already active in? Maybe.
What else is going on in the world as well? If we're involved in a war in the Middle East, then Taiwan is in difficulty.
And the reality is, nobody is physically going to invade China with boots on the ground. This would be a war, if it was to happen, that would have to be using the type of missiles, submarines, and such to establish at least territorial integrity, because you don't want to go into the Middle East with boots where, having that discussion, you sure as heck don't want to go into China.
I assume play one would be trade negotiations to stop trade to China. Step two would be a blockade if needed. I mean, if honestly, because they have a nuclear weapon, there's not much you can do without really putting the world at risk.
Let's continue. And Carl is also on the line. Carl, good morning.
Good morning. How are y'all today?
Good, sir. What's on your mind?
Well.
Well, I just wanted to kind of weigh in. I travel to China about 4 times a year and have done so for the past 5 years. And my work takes me to the outlying provinces, such as Shaanxi and even into Inner Mongolia. So I don't get to go to the nice places like Beijing and Shanghai. And I use the term nice in parenthetically. But I just wanted to weigh in and say that I don't think a lot of Americans realize that really how vast China is, as you've all been saying, and how bad the pollution is and how bad the overbuilding is. But the Chinese people themselves are extremely gracious. But the government is absolutely brutal. I just learned that drunk driving is now a capital offense, and if there is a fatality and you are found guilty of it, you are taken out into the field and shot in the head.
Wow.
There's no question. So I just kind of wanted to get comments from your guest on his observations about the individual Chinese people versus the government.
Okay, thank you so much, Carl.
Yeah, well, certainly both at present and in the past, individual Chinese are not in lockstep with their government necessarily. They may, as I said a couple of moments ago, they're educated by the state. They may believe the basic tenets of the state, but they're individual people. They have their own thoughts and whatnot, and often they behave in ways that individual people will do. The fact that you traveled out in the western part of the country is very interesting, because we really do have very little sense of that, of how different populations, they're not ethnically Chinese for the most part. They're Muslims. Tibetans have their own culture which is being repressed and so forth. But there is a lot of repression and brutality, to be sure. In Xinjiang and Tibet, there have been hundreds of Tibetan monks, for example, who have committed suicide by burning themselves. the Chinese are also cracking down on Muslims in Xinjiang as well, is because they're afraid that these places might become restive and be hotbeds of terrorism.
Will they? I mean, can they? I mean, do you see that sort of thing, or is that just mistaken Chinese fear?
No, I think the Chinese exaggerate the possibility of any kind of resistance to them. Some years ago, I was in Lhasa, for example, in 2008, just a few months after the sort of uprising in the spring of 2008. And in the capital city, there were patrols, armed patrols with machine guns and rifles walking through the main streets 24 hours a day. Sharpshooters on the roofs overlooking the main market. They have this place wrapped up very tightly with repressive capabilities.
Chinese army meets ISIS.
There you go, right?
Scary. We're going to come right back, and 721-1290 is our number. John and Mike, we have about 8 minutes left in the program. We'll do our very best to get both of you on, and we'll be right back. All right, this is Talk Back. Only a few minutes left. John and Mike are waiting, but we have a Facebook comment.
Yeah, it's a quick comment. Not really a question, but an experience from China. It's from Jim on Facebook. He says, to Peter's question on the one-child policy, my sister teaches English in China, and some of the people she works with also specialize in marital counseling. A big unforeseen consequence is that, being the one child into whom the whole family has poured all of their hopes and dreams, they are completely spoiled and self-centered.
Wow.
When a man is able to find a woman and get married, they have very little experience living with other people who are not willing to wait on them hand and foot.
That is absolutely correct.
Wow. All right, let's get John on the line. John, first of all, thank you for holding. Go ahead, sir.
Yes. My question pertains to Chinese history. Most of us Americans have learned that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, but I read the book titled 1421, which had to do with Chinese history and the subsequent years after 1421, when China then moved into an isolationist mode, but before that they were very, very, very global prior to 1421. So I'm curious if the doctor knows about 1421 and what's his opinion, whether that book, how much truism there is.
Okay, thanks, John.
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with that book, actually. I read it, actually reviewed it some years ago. And I think the consensus among China historians of that period, this is back in the Ming Dynasty, is that that's a very good novel, but it shouldn't be taken seriously, that the kind of evidence that Gavin Menzies, the author, adduced is basically made up. I don't know what he was drinking, but...
Now, though Gavin's book of finding the U.S. is not true, there was an expansion, even a navy that apparently took giraffes from Africa and was kind of an ambassador sort of...
That part of it is correct, that the Zhengming, the Chinese admiral, went as far as the east coast of Africa and traveled around India and through the Indian Ocean. But the notion that they went to North America or South America or Australia, there's no basis in fact for that.
Okay, let's get back to the phone and say good morning to Mike. Hi, Mike.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I heard that one of the largest attractions in Tiananmen Square is a large LCD screen of sunrises and sunsets. It's been so long since the people there have seen that because of the pollution and the haze. I think air, you can buy cans of air for sale at shops there, fresh air, because it's so bad. Does your guest see any hope of democracy taking hold with technology and the internet, since everyone there seems to have a smartphone nowadays, and if they can ever get around the censorship, any hopes of growing freedom there?
I'm afraid not. I wish I could say yes.
Thanks, Mike.
But in fact, what's happened is that the Chinese government has more than kept pace with the technological changes. And in fact, very recently, even they've closed down these virtual private networks in which people used in order to detour around the Great Firewall of China. So it's not gonna happen anytime soon.
The Great Firewall of China. All right.
I'm looking at one of these screens. It's actually pretty fantastic. The screen is humongous. I don't know if you want to look at it, but I mean, look how long the screen is. It's like I don't know, one of those panels you might see going through an airport terminal where there's an ad, selling you Coca-Cola or something, It's huge, long, and its backdrop is just a smog-encrusted sky, but it's a picture of the sun coming up in the morning.
So there's still a sun. That's good. Many Chinese may not realize that.
In the minutes left, we had talked about religious oppression in China. Give us some insights, some stories about this. And is there any type of movement, feminist movement at all, that exists within China in terms of women's issues, women's rights?
Yeah, well, okay, two big problems in a minute or so. There are probably more Christians now in China than there are communists, members of the Communist Party. And many of them belong to churches that are not officially recognized by the Chinese government. So the Chinese Communist Party is really paranoid about Christianity. It's paranoid about Islam. It's paranoid about Tibetan Buddhism. It seems to be very powerful, but it's the strongest thing in a sense are its fears. And so there have been increasing crackdowns even on the registered churches and on pastors and whatnot. Christianity is a real threat. No one believes in communism anymore, but people do believe in Christianity. And so the kind of vacuum of faith is what's leading there.
We'll tell you, in our church, we have actually hired in China a young university-age couple who are administering, if you will, to hundreds and hundreds of couples just like themselves, young professionals in China who are coming to Christ in great numbers, and their lives are being transformed, their marriages are being transformed. I mean, all these things are happening literally right under the nose of the Chinese government. And it worries me a bit that there may be a bit of a clampdown here.
Well, a clampdown is going on. I mean, what you just said is fascinating. On the feminist issue, there has been, for the last 20 or 30 years, a kind of feminist movement in China. But the fact is also that in the reform period, there's been a resurgence of kind of male-dominated society. That, if anything, there's been a kind of backward movement in many ways. When the economy tanks, then women are the first ones fired. Women college graduates have a harder time finding employment. But there is more.
They earn lower wages.
They earn lower wages as well. So many problems that are familiar from our own society.
Just like our movie stars, as I learned at the Oscars the other night. This repressive Hollywood system.
Yes. Yeah, we have a minute left. So if folks want to find out more, tell us more about your book, when it's going to be released, and what it deals with. Okay, well, the book, the Deng Xiaoping book, will be released at the end of April, and Deng Xiaoping lived from 1904 to 1997. Very long time. So if you want to learn about 20th century China as well as Deng Xiaoping, that book really covers just about everything from that entire length of time. Wonderful. Where it'd be available, I'm sure, just Amazon and I'm sure it's already for sale. You can pre-order it. Awesome. Okay. Probably get it at the university bookstore, maybe. Could be. Absolutely. And would you autograph it? I would be. He did it again, Bob.
You can keep talking even though you're...
Okay, I was just purged again for a second time, like Deng Xiaoping, actually. Yes, I'd be happy to autograph copies, but the main author is my friend Alexander Pantsov, and I'm just the second guy. I rode shotgun, so to speak. All right. Well, it's a pleasure, always a pleasure having you on. You're welcome anytime. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Okay, what's coming up tomorrow, John, on our fabulous program?
Well, we have a fun opportunity. We're going to talk about Missoula County's growth plan. People will be able to give their input, and they'll actually be accepting it. Usually at these meetings, there's a couple hundred. We'll have thousands listening. So okay, and we will be back tomorrow. Have a great day.